talk about purpose. And we don't even have to use the word. But instead of just saying how much money we're going to make, tell us about a customer whose life we changed, right? What are we doing in the world that makes a difference?
Welcome to Vibecast, the podcast that dives deep into the heartbeat of workplace culture. I'm your host, Shute. Join me in conversations with extraordinary leaders as we unravel their experiences, both positive and negative, that have impacted workplace culture. This podcast is more than storytelling. It's about actionable insights. Are you ready to transform the vibe at your workplace? Let's go. Today, I had the incredible opportunity to chat with Scott Shute. Scott was the former leader of compassion and mindfulness at LinkedIn, and prior to that, called himself Mr. Corporate and held the role of VP Customer Operations. That, of course, was what he was on the outside. But on the inside, he was battling with the desire to allow his spiritual wisdom to have a voice in the boardroom. He was worried that colleagues would dismiss his thing as a bit alternative, and he'd lose their respect. As you'll hear in my conversation with him, he decided to start mainstreaming mindfulness and operationalizing compassion, and is now sharing it with the world through his Changing Work Collective. Well, Scott, thanks for joining me today. I know we've had a few conversations leading up to this, and everyone I walk away feeling inspired by your story. So I'm excited for you to share your story with others today that are listening in. But before we jump into that, I'd just like to really talk about your definition or meaning of what a vibe is, because I think that really helps ground the conversation and the story that you have to share.
So when you say vibe, I think vibe could be range, but I like good vibes. I think that's what we're going for. And so the good vibe is funny. Like I wrote a book on this. My book is called The Full Body Yes. And the full body yes is when you are in alignment with that deepest part of you. And so when we're in alignment with that deepest part of us, I think that's the ultimate good vibe. You know, we don't have the mind chatter. We don't have the noise of our emotions. We don't have the bad vibes.
That's so true. And I think it's like everyone aspires to be there, but how do you get there, right? Because it's such a journey. And before we press record on this, and I know in the past conversations that we've had, it's this push and pull of like what our heart desires and what this world calls for sometimes. And so I'd love to just jump in to hear, how a little bit of your story, because you have such a fascinating story to tell. And I also want to leave a little to mystery so people read your book, because I read it and it was amazing. But I would love to just hear, how you got to where you're at today in trying to cultivate that full body yes for yourself.
Well, I'll talk about it from the professional perspective, which is all it's all included. So it's an all service thing. So I had this part of my life for a long time. I was an executive in customer facing roles. Ultimately, I was a VP at LinkedIn leading customer operations, which was a big job. It's like 1,000 people. It's one of those 24/7 jobs. And there's this other part of me. I think of myself like a dual agent, this part that's been hiding. I've had a meditation practice or a contemplation practice since I was 13. I've been teaching since I was in college, since I was 19. That part of my life has always been a huge part of my life. This part, like, how do I figure myself out? How do I help others figure themselves out? And I finally brought that to LinkedIn, first as a volunteer, leading first just one meditation session. And that first session, which was auspiciously on a Thursday afternoon in the Heavenly Conference Room, there was one person there besides me. And I'm sure that guy was just as terrified as I was. I never saw him again. But the next, the next week there were 3, and then there was 5. Then it grew and grew. I'd get invited to do bigger things. Ultimately, things like our chief financial officer would have an offsite with 400 people and invite me to kick it off with a meditation. So people I knew that I did this. I volunteered for a few years with a whole bunch of other volunteers. We built a mindfulness program, and then I turned it into a full-time gig. Our CEO was out in the world talking about compassion, and he was inside of LinkedIn talking about his own practice. He gave the commencement address at Wharton and talked about compassion. Very buttoned down, serious Wharton, which I thought was very brave. Next day, he's on TV, Good Morning America, or one of those shows, and all they want to talk about is compassion in work, compassion in business. So I made a pitch to him. Like, I'm the operations guy. I can help us operationalize compassion. We can help mainstream mindfulness. And that was my job. I was the head of mindfulness and compassion programs for 3 years at LinkedIn. So it's funny, people would say things to me like, "Oh, when did this happen to you? Like, when did you become, this mindfulness guy?" I'm like, "Yeah, always." It's like I finally get to be the person I always was. That's the beautiful part, right? I was just hiding it all this time. So it's been a big part of me. And now I'm out in the world, helping other leaders and other companies be more conscious, be better human beings.
So, can you talk a little bit more in detail about that shift from like before that very first class when that guy was in there? Clearly, if he didn't come back, he was talking to others about it, right? Because others came back and it turned into a whole thing. So, whatever impression you made on him during that first class where he was one on one was a good one, it sounds like.
Yeah, that or we just marketed better. I don't know.
Yeah, there you go. Well, can you talk to me about what led up to that and how you felt encouraged inside an organization to take that leap of faith and on that meditation class? Because I think people struggle with that. They're designed for something, but they try to segregate these 2 parts of their life.
It's a good question. I think there were several things at play, the confluence of events. On the one hand, yes, our CEO was talking about mindfulness and compassion, and that created this umbrella of safety for the topic. I didn't have to pitch anything. Our CEO was talking about it. So that was really, really powerful. The other thing that happened, so the external circumstances create a safety, and then the internal circumstances, right? So in that moment, I don't know how old I was. I was in my mid 40s or late 40s. I was a VP at LinkedIn. It was one of the most desirable jobs on the planet. And I was feeling comfortable in my own skin, right? In ways that I know many people don't, right? I get it. But I was comfortable in my own skin. And so I felt safe. It's like, oh my God, whatever, if the worst thing happens, like if I get fired, because we catastrophize things, if this goes really badly and I get fired, I'm fine. I'll find another job in 2 minutes. It'll not be a problem. So I think a lot of these things have to come together. And when people ask me, oh, how do I get a job like that? How do I do it? I always just say, just start. Just start doing it. I was a volunteer for 3 or 4 years. I had led literally hundreds of meditations and probably 50 workshops. And I was leading the program. I had, spearheaded the whole thing. And so 3 years later, when I finally said, hey, I'd like to do this as a full-time role, it wasn't, well, have you ever done any of this work before? It's like, no, I have this giant body of work, right? I'm already doing the role.
Yeah, so often people, like, glorify that you just, like, "Oh, they're just lucky," or they just somebody gave them a chance and they haven't given me a chance, or, people tend to victimize themselves because they don't think they've had the opportunity. What they haven't done is just put in the work to create the opportunity, right? So it's like
Just put in the work. I doubt if anybody's stopping you from calling a meeting on a Thursday afternoon at 4:30 or even 6 o'clock after work and putting up a flyer that says, join me for a meditation. I doubt anybody's going to stop you.
So why maybe prior to that in your career, why do you think you stopped yourself or didn't you weren't comfortable in your own skin to put something like that into the world? Because as you mentioned, this meditation practice started when you were 13 years old and you're talking about your mid 40s. That's 30 years of development, you could probably say, but like what was the main thing that you could say got in your way of just being you in the workplace to create such a groundswell?
It's a good question. I had to get there too in my own understanding of what I was trying to do. Also, I probably had a little bit of separation of church and state idea between work and like my practice outside of work is a very spiritual practice, right? This is my connection with the divine. And so, probably in my early years, I didn't know how to tune it so that it would be appropriate at work. But as I became a leader and as I have more experience in the world and as I have more language and building bridges, it's like, oh, I can do lots of things that aren't about my spiritual path, that aren't even about spirituality directly at all. We can do this in a secular way. And so part of it was my own learning and my own understanding of like what is appropriate. And I think that's a really important lesson too. People will come with these things, lots of different things from the outside, and it's like a completely different language than the world of work. And so I think this is one of the reasons I've been successful at this is that I wear both hats. I know what it's like to be very much on the inside of work and being a senior leader inside of work. I know the language and I've had this other experience. So having these two things, I was then more comfortable to put them together. There's another part where sometimes at work, I just didn't feel safe, right? There have been times in my career where I was very successful and viewed as very successful. And I think my time at LinkedIn was that. And there were other times in my career or certain roles or with certain managers where the external view of me was not that positive, right? And that happens too. The environment that we're in, whether we get the good vibe or the bad vibe, or we vibe with the people we're around, that's really important. And turns out this is a survival factor. We look for safety. The number one factor in a high performing team, in high performance, is safety, psychological safety. And so for sure, there have been little periods of time in my career where I just did not feel safe to do that.
So I think I want to explore that for a minute, if you don't mind. So what did that look like in practice, right? Because I think psychological safety is a big term that gets thrown around both on the good, creating good and bad vibes. But I think in practice, like how did you experience that? So somebody can identify that for themselves and say, the reason I'm not exploring something is because not as an excuse, but just to work through it or identify and put it in their Rolodex, like, when I'm a leader over here, I definitely do not want to be doing that. Or I definitely won't be doing that. Like, can you explain what that looked like or maybe give a story? You can withhold the names so nobody's identity is thrown under the
Totally.
bus.
Totally. Well, there were periods in my career where I didn't have a champion. By champion, I mean my boss and I either didn't know each other that well or didn't trust each other that well, or so there's this inherent lack of safety. And at a survival instinct, we're looking, our amygdalas are always firing, looking for the things that could literally hurt us or kill us. And so in a professional setting, that means getting fired, right? That's the worst thing that's going to happen to us in a professional setting. And without a champion, there were definitely times where it's like, oh, if I mess up at work, like it's just one more log on the fire that this manager is going to put that then I don't feel protected. Where I moved from one of those roles to go work for someone who was my champion. And it was an environment where I knew he had my back. And I was not perfect. I still made the same mistakes. It's like, but when I made a mistake, we could have a conversation about it, and in a way that like I didn't have to be defensive. It's like, oh, here's what I did, and here's what I can do next time, and then he would tell me, well, here's what you might try, and here's what you could learn. We could have a real conversation about it instead of like a beating, or it feels like a beating. And I think that comes down to oftentimes our relationship with our manager. So when we think about, all right, well, what can we do? What can we do as employees or as the manager is really have deeper conversations. Like get to know each other at a human level. Get to build that trust. There's a technique I use. I learned it from my friend Kevin Delaney, who was my friend and mentor and manager at LinkedIn. It's called the 7-minute story. So the idea is that the first time you meet with somebody that you're going to meet with on a regular basis, like a new boss, a new colleague, a new business partner, in your first half hour one-on-one or hour long one-on-one, take 7 minutes each, so 15 minutes ish total, and just share the story of your life. And the other person, their job is to just sit and hold space and listen and be attentive. And it's amazing what happens in those 7 minutes because you feel the spaciousness. All of a sudden, it feels like half an hour, right? You just talking for 7 minutes feels like a long time. And the beauty of someone else holding that space, knowing that they're going to reciprocate. And when that happens, what we find is people go deeper. They start to share a little bit deeper. You could say they get a little bit more vulnerable. And what we know about vulnerability is that humans are wired to mirror vulnerability. So if we're brave enough to go first, the other person is very highly likely to reciprocate that vulnerability. And that vulnerability, if you go back to thinking about survival, animals, when they will share with each other, will lift their necks or lift their heads and expose their vitals to each other as a show of vulnerability, as a way to get closer, to say, I'm not a danger to you. So we as Homo sapiens do all the same things as animals because guess what? We are animals.
So, as you moved into a leadership role, that's fascinating, by the way. And I love that. I actually was in a meeting earlier this week, and I wouldn't say we shared a 7 minute story. It was a larger group, but we did something interesting at first, like an icebreaker, which can seem kind of cheesy in the term itself, but it was, if you had an extra 2 hours in your day, what would you do with that 2 hours? And that really opened up people to share personally what they would do, because it's rare somebody says, I'd work for 2 more hours. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe, but if you start asking why, you get to something that's not work related typically. But it was fascinating how people opened up about what they would do and why they would do it. And that really gets to that kind of the core of like who they are designed to be. So,
And it's interesting, even how you talked about it. You almost apologized for it. And I think these things are so powerful. This is not time wasted. This is time invested in the power of the team. So if these are people that you're going to work with or need to trust or build together, this is actually one of the most valuable things you can do together as a team. Because if you build that trust, if you build that shorthand of trust, then later, a week later, a month later, a year later, when conflict happens, which it inevitably does, or a problem happens you need to solve together, the two of you or five of you or 500 of you are going to be at a different place and you're going to solve it much quicker. You're going to come up with more creative solutions because you're not in a fight or flight, danger zone from your body. It's actually incredibly important. And so part of what we can do is do these activities with full on and not be apologetic for it. It's like, hey, let's invest in the team. Can we take 10 minutes at the beginning of this meeting? And maybe we do it every second or third meeting, right? So it doesn't feel like rote. It doesn't feel like, oh, we have to do this and people get bored.
can you talk to me specifically where okay, so you had a leadership experience, but then you became the leader, right? And you're leading this 1,000 person organization. That's a whole lot of people to be able to individually inspire, right? So, how did you do that as an executive? And maybe an individual story about how you turned a leader on your team's way of thinking around, because you're now inspiring others to inspire others, right?
So sometimes I get the question like, oh my God, that must have been so stressful. 1,000 people. How did you do that? Like the truth is, the first time I was a manager and I managed 8 people was actually way more stressful. Because here's the thing, as a manager, you're really never managing more than 8 or 10 people directly, right? It's just that they start having bigger organizations underneath them. And so your individual coaching is mostly for those 7 to 10 people that are directly in your space. Now, creating a culture, creating a larger work group when it goes beyond the 8 to 80 or 800 or 8,000 or 80,000 is then all about communications. It's realizing that everything you say and do is magnified, because that may be the only time of the week or the day or the year that that person in the organization sees you. So if they see you once every 4 months, then what you say in the 2 minutes during that little interaction is really important. the same goes the other way too, right? If you're in front of your VP once every 4 months, like, get it right.
That is true. It's rare you hear it like talked about as a two-way street unless you're talking about career development and stuff like that. But you're absolutely right. And like creating this culture and this energy and this vibe is really comes from both sides. It's not just the leader's responsibility, although they there's a heavy weight on that. There is a responsibility from the individual contributor population, if you will, to meet them also to create that synergy.
Here's an interesting thing that I have learned as a speaker, and I think it's true as a leader as well. If you think about a speaker, you're getting ready to go on stage, you're going to facilitate a workshop. I really, really believe it's not so much an information exchange as it is an energy exchange. So Maya Angelou had that quote about, people don't remember what you say, they remember how you made them feel. And so that's what I'm saying too. It's like you can have all these brilliant models and have all these things, but people only remember how you made them feel, which is energy. So it comes back to your word of vibe, right? If you put off a bad vibe or an awkward vibe or a angry vibe, that's what they're going to get. And so when you have a chance as a leader, goes the other way too, as a person, let's just say, any situation, when you have a chance and you're in front of somebody, you are the message. The message is the messenger. And yes, if you're eloquent, that helps. If you tell good stories, that helps. But the energy you start from is most of it.
Okay, so tell us your biggest turnaround story. I just believe and feel what you're up to, and we'll get to that in a minute, like what you're doing now and the change you want to make in the world. But I want to hear like, and for anybody listening, what that biggest turnaround story was, and so people could be like, "Wow."
Well, I have lots of leadership stories about. I'll tell one. So I'll tell a couple. I'll tell one after this. So I worked with this woman for, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 years. She was on my team. So we're one-on-ones every week or every other week. Probably we were together 4 or 5 hours of meetings every week. So we spent a lot of time together. And over that time, I watched, and I was both her coach and mentor and boss, right? So it's wrapped up all in one. But I watched her soften. In the beginning, very much driven by the activity of the work, the activity. Like, okay, well, I told them to do it and they're doing it. And I'm only, here are my 5 goals and how's I'm doing against the goals. And the feedback in the beginning was, yeah, we're doing okay against the goals, but there's a trail of bodies behind, 'cause, like, people are not really enjoying working with this person. And so over time, I helped them see, and look, I wasn't the only one, the situation too, but helped them see how important it was to move from me to we, to move from thinking about, because this is what happens to managers. We often get promoted because we were the best salesperson or HR partner or, engineer. And then all of a sudden we're managing people. It's like, whoa, this is a whole different game. And so when a leader can move from thinking just about themselves and their own individual tasks to actually it's not about me at all anymore, it's about the team. And so this was the transformation that this person went to what they talked about on stage when they would do their all hands went from talking about the work that they personally were doing or involved in or thinking about to the work that the team was doing or celebrating the people on the team or celebrating the customers that they would serve. So over time, over the course of like 4 or 5 years, that was a pretty deep transformation.
And I think that's important to note that this doesn't just happen with like the flip of a switch or with one concrete action, right? It's people pouring into other people to show them that they care about them and they're concerned about them. And I don't mean concerned in a negative way, but like there's care and concern over you to do good and to make a good impact. So giving that safety to them to continue to be vulnerable, right?
That's right. Okay, now I'll tell a different something that happened just in more of a one-time thing. So part of what I do is I do keynote speaking, and I was on the East Coast. I live on the West Coast. I was on the East Coast doing a gig for like a director's of sales conference. So a leadership conference for sales for one company. And I went the night before to the meet and greet, and it was a bunch of guys like my age or older. And I'm doing a keynote on mindfulness. I'm not exactly on mindfulness, but I'm doing a keynote on, why should we care about our mental well-being and about joy and, inspirational stuff. And I was thinking, oh my goodness, is my West Coast vibe going to play here? And I was a little bit nervous about it. And so I, for a little bit, got in my own head about, how this was going to go. And finally I decided, you know what? They paid me to be here. I'm going all the way. I'm not dummying it down. I'm going all the way. Let's see what happens. So next day I had a 45-minute keynote. As part of the keynote, I even got them to meditate for 5 minutes. And I looked up in the middle, and 170 people are all doing it. Directors and VPs of sales are all doing it. And then I had a workshop in the afternoon that they took turns kind of going through, where we talked about building resilience. And I thought it went pretty well. So then we're on the bus. This whole thing was at Disney. So we're on the bus headed to dinner. I didn't know anybody. I'm the guest speaker. And this guy sits down next to me on the bus. He clearly knew who I was. And he goes, "Hey, nice work today." He goes, "You got me." I'm like, "What do you mean?" He goes, "You know, when they introduced you and the topic, I thought, oh man, this is going to be such a load of." He said, and so I was distracted. I didn't care. But then you had some good stories. I thought it was funny. So I kept listening. And then later in the afternoon, I went to your workshop and I did the whole meditation thing. He goes, "I got to tell you, brother, I am all in. I am all in. What can I do next?" And I thought, there it is. There it is. This finding a bridge, right? My ability to be able to find a bridge between these two worlds and how it's all relevant.
One, I'm not sure if it's just, well, in my opinion, it's this integration of how we do life with work has become so apparent in the pandemic and post-pandemic, right? The way of the world has changed, and there's an enlightening among people that like, oh, there can be this integration. But also, habits are habits, right? And we just do things the way we do. So to break that and to have organizations start to think about what that integration looks like so that work doesn't feel like work, you can inspire people whether they stay in your organization or they leave. You don't want them there feeling uninspired and uninterested and not cared for, right? Like that's not going to produce anything for anybody in a positive way.
There are some really simple things that leaders can do to make this better. It's actually not super complicated. One is just taking a bit of an inventory about what you talk about when you stand on stage, right? Whether it's the company all hands or the company meeting, or whether it's a staff meeting or a department meeting, think about what you're saying. What are we focusing on? If we're only focusing on, all right, well, let's look at all the numbers and review the numbers and let's, okay, fine. Or if your only visionary thing is to say, oh, we're the next unicorn, right? We're going to be the next $10 billion startup and blah, blah, blah. Honestly, neither of those are very inspiring. The unicorn will be inspiring for a bit, right? Because everybody wants to be on a winning team. Everybody wants to make money. But those dreams don't always come to fruition, and money doesn't buy, joy. So some simple changes or simple things to make sure that we're talking about is talk about purpose. And we don't even have to use the word. But instead of just saying how much money we're going to make, tell us about a customer whose life we changed. Right? What are we doing in the world that makes a difference? And more and more companies are getting this, but talk about how we're changing the world for the better. And that, because as an individual, I need to be able to connect the dots between my job in wherever, accounting or finance or HR or engineering. I have to be able to connect the dots between the work I do every day and that here's how we're making the world a better place. If I can do that, if you make it clear to me, yeah, I'm going to show up, I'm going to give my best. If it's hazy and it just feels like, oh, we're just helping the CEO pad his bonus, yeah, not so much.
And that's becoming I don't know if it's more and more important or just, again, more visible to others that like there's more to life than work. As people and organizations and you see things in the world start to talk about like making an impact, I think people now are comfortable sharing that they want something bigger than just a paycheck. So I want to pivot for a minute and I want you to talk about the work that you're doing today, right? So you've left LinkedIn and you're out to change the world. So share more about like what you're up to, like how you're, expanding your reach to more and more people and inviting them in and just yeah.
Yeah, it's been a fun journey. So when I was at LinkedIn, head of mindfulness compassion programs, people would ask me, what does that even mean? Like what is compassion at work? Does that just mean we're all nice to each other and we get soft? Like, no. So I wrote a book to kind of explain it. And the book is The Full Body Yes. And it was my kind of entry point into this world of like, how do you build the bridge? How do we talk about, the journey of becoming a better person in the workplace? And ended up leaving LinkedIn September of 21. Wow, whenever, somewhere in there. And started doing speaking and consulting and whatnot. And my mission is to change work from the inside out. And I mean it for 3.5 billion people. And so quickly realized, like, oh, it's going to take way more than me in my little corner of the world to make a dent here. So I got together with my current business partner, Nicholas, and we created this thing called the Changing Work Collective. And the first part of this is, again, with the same mission, change work from the inside out, conscious business practices and their practitioners. So in this first phase, we're collecting people who are the practitioners, the coaches and podcasters and thought leaders of the world, and trying to help them be more successful at their business. And also to curate the best practices of conscious business from them. And then phase two is then make that curation available to businesses, to leaders, to enterprises. So, as an example, we're just kicking off. I'm super excited about this project. We're going to write a book together. And so, the way it works is 20 or 25 of us each write a chapter um, on conscious leadership. And the idea is that I want this book to be a springboard for those 25 people. So maybe they go on and each write their own book, or it's a way for them to kind of get started on the process, to find their voice. But there's something else that's super interesting. One of our friends inside of the collective reached out and he said, this is a great idea. In fact, this is what the Quakers do. I said, what? Really? He's like, this is what the Quakers do. It's like a collective question. And they write books together as a way to advance their collective and individual thinking about things. In other words, to advance their individual and collective understanding of the divine. And I thought, oh my God. In other words, they're like writing the holy book as they go. And I thought, this is what we're doing. We are trying to find the boundaries of our understanding of what it means to be a conscious leader, of what conscious business means at all. And we're going to spur the conversation. We're going to get people to join us, and we will both individually and collectively increase our understanding.
That's always fascinating because sometimes we think we have to do something new and different in order to spur change. And so one of my beliefs is to keep things super simple. And that's one of the things of creating, a vibe in the workplace. I think is we need to go back to the basics. And that's a perfect example of like, we don't need to recreate a process. We don't need to recreate something. Let's just go back to what people have done before us that have made an impact and done something great and take something from that, right? Like, let's not reinvent. Let's build off of, or let's look back and pause for a minute. I think that's part of the problem we run into is we don't take a moment to pause and think about like what's out in the world. We have our hand like so many things at our fingertips, what's out in the world that we can actually just go and recreate and make better.
That's right. There's very few, if any, original ideas. Of course, there's new technologies and that sort of thing. But the basic philosophical ideas, there's really not much new. So, one example, I love James Clear's book, Atomic Habits. I know probably 7 billion of the 8 billion people on the planet have read it by now. Who knows? But one of the quotes, which I love, which is one of the two kind of fundamental teachings of the book, is I'll paraphrase: Our lives do not rise to the level of our goals, they fall to the level of our systems, which is genius. And you know who said it first? Well, Archilochus said it 2,500 years ago. He's a Greek philosopher. And probably Archilochus got it from one of his mentors that wrote it down 700 years before that. There are no new ideas. There are new stories. There are new situations. There are new contexts. Each one of it is totally unique while at the same time being 99% like everybody else.
And that's why the stories are so important, right? Because it puts context around these like foundational ideas or processes or systems or what have you, right? But it puts that that relevant context around those things, and people are like, "Oh yeah," so it gets them rallied around an idea because then there's relatability, or they can pull something from it and say like, "Oh yeah, that reminds me of this or that," right? But and that's why I just like love storytelling so much and hearing others' stories, which is probably why I started podcasting in the first place. Gives me an opportunity to not just look like a really nosy person, but to really hear the stories out of curiosity. um, is there anything else that you'd like to share and that you'd like to just, inspire people with? You've given so much good advice and context to what you're doing in the world today and what you've done already. But if there is one thing, is there anything else?
I think it goes back to stuff that we already know and we keep simple, right? Like some of the best advice I ever got was like, just be yourself, right? Just be you. Stop trying to be anybody else. Stop trying to live other people's lives. Tune in with that deepest part of you. Figure out who you really are and be that person all the time.
I think that's the key all the time. It is hard. And don't waver in it. I know I spoke on a panel not too long ago, and there was I was just like trying to get myself inspired for like how am I going to inspire others, right? Like and make it understandable. I'm sure you do this in keynote speaking as well, right? But there's something that really rang true to me that I shared, and I think this is also what you're trying to say here is like, don't focus on being known, but focus on being yourself. And then you'll naturally be known for those things that are aligned with who you're meant to be. And so it's like, yeah, be you all the time. And that doesn't mean you have to be liked by everybody. That doesn't mean you have to be for everybody, right? That's okay.
One of my favorite things I saw recently was Christopher Plowman, who's the CEO of Insight Timer. I'm also a meditation teacher on Insight Timer if you want to come hang out with me there. But he on LinkedIn was introducing his new CMO, or Insight Timer's new chief marketing officer. And he was, very flowery about his description of this woman who was coming in to do the job. And basically, I'll paraphrase, but he said, and I've kind of given her the hardest job in the world because I told her we don't do promotion. We only do attraction. Now think about that. You're the CMO in a world that is so noisy that we feel like we have to shout louder than everybody else. And their on purpose strategy as a business is to not shout, is to not promote, but only just be so good at what they do that they attract.
But imagine a world where we all even did that half of the time.
So I think that is a beautiful, we talk about energy. I think that's a beautiful energetic shift. It's kind of like, it's kind of like, when you're dating, I'll just go back for myself in like high school or college. When I wasn't in a relationship, and I really wanted to be, then you put off this desperation, vibe. But as soon as you're in a relationship, then you're comfortable in your own skin, and then people are like so attracted to you, and then they're coming out of the woodwork. Business works the same way.
That's true. Business, leadership, being an individual contributor. I mean, you could relate that to all of those scenarios, right? Of just like be you always, and then the environment will create itself.
Be you always. Calm down.
Take
You're
a deep
good.
breath. Go meditate. That's
Right.
awesome. Well, thank you so much. I just really appreciate there's like a calmness about this conversation that has been good for me personally too. So your effect even virtually is felt. So I appreciate that a lot and you spending the time to just share your wisdom with the world.
I appreciate you. And if you're listening out there, go and be an ambassador of compassion, because we need more of it.
It's a bit selfish of me to say that my conversation with Scott was just what I needed today. His way of being has a calmness that even transcended the virtualness of our conversation. I love how he described the idea of communication not being an information exchange, but rather an energy exchange. As leaders in an organization, it's so important that we realize this and truly think about what you are saying and how you are saying it to your teams. Ask yourself one simple question. Where is your focus when you're communicating? Is it always on the numbers, financials, and operations? Or do you talk about the purpose of your organization and how each role plays an integral part in impacting that purpose? Take a minute to think about that today. And as Scott says, just start doing it. You can find Scott on LinkedIn and through the Changing Work Collective. All the links are in the show notes. If this episode inspired you and you want to see how you can take the next step to creating a better vibe within your organization, I'd love for you to download our complimentary 75 Vibes worksheet. This is a simple tool to create a habit and mindset around creating great vibes in work and life. The best part, it's simple and it works.